My name is Tony Briggle, and my multifaceted business life at one point took me to Neiman Marcus back in the days when they were still Neiman Marcus, owned by the Marcus family. And I started out as a customer relations guy, and Stanley Marcus, who was the president, kept promoting me, and before I knew it, I ended up with being head of public relations and special events for all the multitudinous affairs and events that Stanley Marcus put on for many years at Neiman Marcus. So fast forward a few years, and I am in a friend's home in Dallas, Texas, uh, and we were there for drinks and dinner. And I walked down the hall, and I was stunned with the beautiful black and white photographs I saw hanging on the wall of their family, Baron and Dido Kidd, and their kiddos. And I'd never seen the lighting and the composition. It just was breathtaking. So I took note of it, little having any idea that a week later I would be scrambling to find out who that photographer was. So here's what happened. Stanley calls me from New York on a Monday, and he said, Tony, I need you to go to Puerto Vallarta for a photo shoot. I said, all right, sir, I'll be glad to do that. When? And he said, this weekend. I said, okay, I'll need to find a photographer. He said, it'll need to be a great one because you're going to photograph Elizabeth Taylor at her home in Puerto Vallarta in the most expensive fur coat in the world at that time, $125,000. A combination of Koja mink and sable. And I said, well, now that you just upped the ante considerably, Mr. Stanley, because I've got to have her approval of the photographer. He said, I have told her that I would approve the photographer, and she's agreed to that. So go find me a photographer, Tony. So I picked up the phone and I called New York, called the Avedons and the Webbers and all the ones that we were used to dealing with. Everybody was booked 6 months out, and I said, no, it's got to be this weekend. They just laughed at me. So it came back into my head about those stunning photographs that I saw at the kids' house. So I called the house, and their maid answered, and she said, well, they're not available. Well, back in those days, that was the code word that everybody knew meant they were out of town. But they didn't want to tell anybody because they didn't know who you were. So I said, okay, it's Tony Briggle, and I need to hear back ASAP from either Dido or Baron. I've got a question about their photographer, and I need to hear from them. So about 30 minutes later, Barron called me. He said, my God, what's going on? They got me off the slopes. He was skiing in Colorado. And I said, who was the photographer behind those photographs? And he said, John Haynsworth from Palm Beach. I said, do you have his phone number? And he said, well, of course I don't have his phone number. I'm skiing. But there can only be one John Haynsworth in Palm Beach. Give him a call. I said, okay. So I called information, and I got a John Haynsworth, and a John Haynsworth answered the phone, and I said, this is Tony Briggle in Dallas, and you don't know me, but you took some photographs of some friends of mine, the kids. He said, oh yes, I knew the kids. And incidentally, Mrs. Kidd was a DuPont, and he had taken the family photographs up in at their place in Delaware. And I said, well, I need you to do a shoot for me. Are you free this weekend? He said, let me check my book. Yes, I'm free. Where in Palm Beach are you going to be doing the shoot? And I said, well, it's not going to be in Palm Beach. It's going to be in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. And he said, well, that's all right. I can be there by Saturday. I said, that's good. And I said, bring your finest equipment because we're going to be shooting Elizabeth Taylor in the world's most expensive fur coat. There was this long pause, and he said, let's start all over again. Tell me your name again. Who are you? And so I gave him the information, and he said, well, let me check a few things and I'll call you back. Well, I knew what he was going to check was Baron Kidd's phone number, so I gave him the number up in Colorado, and he called me back about 30 minutes later. He said, I can do it. I said, okay, if you'll book your ticket, I will get the Neiman Marcus to cover it, and I'll meet you at whatever time the plane was arriving on that Saturday. He said, how will I know you? And I said, you won't, but I'll know you because you'll be the only guy getting off the plane with enough photographic equipment to photograph Elizabeth Taylor. He said, you're right. So I met him at the airport, got him settled, and the very first night we went up to Elizabeth's, and I'd never met her, and certainly John had. And she invited us to stay for dinner with Richard. And we were supposed to make the shoot the next day because it was just a weekend that I'd booked John for just the weekends. But she looked at me and said, well, please tell Stanley Marcus that I thank him and that you were here, and we appreciate that. And John was standing beside me and had not been introduced to her as yet. And I noticed she wasn't looking at me as much as she was looking at John standing next to me. And John was this great, big, tall, robust-looking guy with golden locks that were curly and wavy and flowed in the breeze and all that kind of stuff. He was a personification of Palm Beach, which you really think, except he also looked like a matinee model and idol. And so she turned to him and she said, and you are? And he said, I'm John Haynsworth. And you do what? And he said, I'm the photographer. And she said something to the effect of, well, how old are you? And John said, well, I'm 24, 25, whatever his age was at the time. And she said, well, you must be good if Neiman Marcus has called you to do this shoot and if I've agreed to it. And John said, I am. And he was. So we left early that night and we're back up bright and early the next morning, about 10 o'clock. The shoot was going to be at 12, and at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, the Burtons appeared. So clearly we'd lost the sun that day. So we made a date for the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day, and we were into the first weekend. And we still couldn't find a time that suited Elizabeth and Richard between all their guests that were coming in and out, as well as their rather frequent late dinner parties that didn't allow them to get up early in the morning. So about midway through this event, I get a call from Stanley Marcus that said, Tony, what's going on? You were supposed to be gone for the weekend and you're still gone. I said, well, Mr. Marcus, Miss Taylor and Mr. Burton are very busy people, and I'm here at their disposal. And my photographer's got to go home, so I'm having to pay him overtime because he's missing shoots. And he's not happy by any stretch of the imagination. But I said, if you want to talk to somebody that's really unhappy, I suggest you call Evelyn, my wife, and who's home with our two daughters, and who wonders why I'm still here a week and 5 days later with Elizabeth Taylor. So if you can help me explain that to her, then I'll deal with you when I get back to the house. He said, I understand. Just come home as soon as you can. So I did. We went up to Richard and Elizabeth that night. John and I did. And I took Richard Burton out on his balcony. And I said, Richard, I've got a problem. I'm going to get fired. My photographer is going to leave. And we must do this shoot tomorrow. And as a matter of fact, John captured a picture of me standing on the balcony talking to Richard. And Richard's gazing out across the water. And I'm giving him my sincerest pitch about I've got to make this so it can't happen. I'm going to have to take the coat and go home. So he said, come the next morning at 10 o'clock. The sun will be right. We'll get it done. I said, okay. So we arrived at 10 o'clock the next morning, and she was up, and he was up, but she'd flown her hairdresser in to have from California, Sidney Gerloff, was the hairdresser to the stars at the time, and all the water in Puerto Vallarta had gone off. The water pump for the whole city that had broken had been sent away to be repaired, and the backup had also broken. So Miss Taylor was out lying on the side of her swimming pool with her long locks in the water in the swimming pool, and Sidney Gerloff was in the pool and scrub-a-dub-a-dubbing the hair. And so, of course, we had to wait till all that got through, and then we had to wait till the famous Mr. Sidney got all the hair rolled up in the great big rollers. And then we had to wait until all the maids got the food ready because we were going to have a picnic out on the beach. Now, that's another very significant thing. The word beach did not come into the discussion until very late in my time being down there. I had perceived that we were going to photograph the coat in the house with Liz Taylor in one of her very fine suits with appropriate jewelry, etc. Au contraire, she wanted to do it on the beach in a bikini. Well, I'd been there so long that I thought I'll just have to deal with Mr. Stanley when I get back to Neiman Marcus, because that's where it's going to be taken, and we'll just have to do what we can to make this go. So I have the coat, and we get everybody together. I had borrowed a friend's car who lived in Puerto Vallarta, big Buick, and so I get in the Buick with John and all the equipment, and then two Jeeps, Richard driving one with Elizabeth and Mr. Gerloff, and the second beach is driven by a myriad of help from the house to lay out the picnic lunch that we were going to have. So we wind around, get out to the ocean, and it really is a spectacular view. I'll have to say that, and it's where Richard and Elizabeth would often go. Well, I guess the appropriate way to say skinny dipping in the ocean and privately. And so they lay out all the food, and of course, I probably failed to mention that there had been a lot of vodka consumed from the beginning of the hair washing uh, throughout the lunch. And so by the time we got through with the lunch, the light was getting ready to fade, and I went over to Richard and I said, "Richard, this is it." And he said, "Okay, okay, okay." So he said, "Elizabeth, we're taking the picture. These young men have to go. We're taking the picture." So she said, "Oh, all right." So Mr. Gerloff takes all the curlers out of her hair, and I don't know how much you know about beaches and humidity and ladies' hairs. However, I can promise you most everybody's hair goes completely straight because of humidity. So all that hour spent with Mr. Gerloff to make the hair so spectacular was for naught. So there Miss Taylor is standing on the beach with her hair looking like it had never been curled. And I looked at Sidney, and my eyes got very wide. And he said, "Don't worry, Tony. Don't." By that time, we were Sidney and Tony. "Don't worry, Tony. I've got it taken care of." So he goes back to the Jeep, brings these big wig boxes out, and brings all these different wigs out and puts them on Elizabeth's head. And I look at him and I said, "Sidney, couldn't you have done that at 9 o'clock this morning instead of washing the hair? I mean, it's all here, buddy. We could have been halfway back to the States by now. However, let's go with it." So we he started taking pictures. John did, and uh, but they were first just candid, and then I started saying, "Now we've got to get serious." And so Richard said, "Elizabeth, see that big rock over there? You need to get up on that and stand up on it, because and with the wind blowing in your hair, it's going to be wonderful." She said, "Richard, I have vertigo." I'll fall. He's nonsense, woman. Get up on the rock. So I help her up on the rock, and there's another shot of me standing there holding her hand so she won't fall off. The problem was I obviously couldn't be in the picture. So when John was ready to shoot, he said, "Okay, Tony, move." And so I dropped her hand and pulled out of sight of the camera. And as I was looking back, she was absolutely right. She fell off into the sand, and there she was laying on her back, groaning. And I ran over to her, and she said, "Oh, my back, my back." Well, you probably don't remember much about this, but she was notorious for having a bad back and had multiple surgeries on it. So I just assumed that my life, as I had known it, was over. That the best thing for me to do was be James Mason from A Star Is Born and just walk into the water, because my wife and two daughters would be much, much better off, and Stanley would be much better off, because the lawsuit that's going to come from this is going to be astronomical. And Richard meandered over. John came running over. Everybody was trying to help her up, and every time we touched her, she would groan. He didn't touch her. He just stood there and looked down at her, and he said, "Elizabeth, the tide is coming in. It's going to be here in about a minute, and your new fur coat's going to be ruined. What are you going to do about it?" She jumped up just like that. So then I got mad, because I was getting ready to do my James Mason walk into the ocean bit for the good of God, wife, family, country, and Stanley Marcus. Not a thing wrong. But she was a little unhappy with Richard, which she was most of the time. That was their love-hate thing that went on a lot in their life. So we get back on the rock. This time Richard gets up on it, and she is propped up against it, and she's holding his hand, and John is just clicking like crazy, going every angle possible. But he can't hear what I'm hearing. I have never heard such sailor talk between two people in my life. And when I looked at that photograph a month or two later, I thought, my God, they look like the couple most in love in the world, and what they were saying to one another were the most hateful things you could imagine. But anyway, we got the shot, and that part of it was good, and I was relieved. And as we were packing up to get in the cars to go back to the house to unload, and then we were going to say bye-bye, I looked up and I saw some lights flashing. And I said, "Richard, I think those are flash bulbs." Shows you how, this was 1969, they still had flash bulbs. And he said, "Oh my God, that's how his pictures got in that German magazine." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, I guess I forgot to tell you, but we did have some pictures taken of us skinny dipping that appeared in a German magazine a few months ago, and we wondered how they got it." And I said, "And you didn't tell me this? This is supposed to be exclusively ours, and I'm supposed to go back and convince Life or Look or somebody to put this on their cover?" And he said, "Well, I'm sorry, Tony. I just forgot." I said, "Okay, let's just get out of here as fast as we can." So we start packing everything up. The lights are still flashing, and uh, uh, Elizabeth uh, takes the coat off, and I put the coat in the back seat, and she says, "I'm cold." Well, the only thing that we had left to put on her was my shirt, my pullover, my polo shirt. So I took it off, and she put it on, and I was trying to help her in the beach in the Jeep, and Richard said, "Oh, no, put her in your car, put her in your car, and I'll put a babushka around one of the maids, and they'll think it's Elizabeth, and they'll follow me." I said, "Follow? What? They're going to follow us?" He said, "Oh yeah, the chase is on. You better hurry." So I told Elizabeth, I got Elizabeth in the front seat, and I take off going one direction, and Richard takes off going another. And I look in the rearview mirror. Sure enough, here comes the Volkswagen, and it goes after Richard. And so we part and meet up again. And by that time, they realized that Elizabeth was not with Richard, so they figured, rightfully so, that she was with me. So the next thing I know, in the rearview mirror, here comes the Volkswagen. The Volkswagens can get in small places. Big Buicks can't even think about getting it. And it was borrowed too. I couldn't wreck my friend's car. So I put the pedal to the metal and start racing through the yard. If chickens are flying, peasants are flying, I mean, it's unbelievable. Paparazzi's pulling up trying to take pictures of us. I said, Elizabeth, get down on the floor. So she gets down on the floor, and the next thing I know, my senses just go into overload, because here I am in Mexico driving a friend's great big car with the paparazzi chasing me. Elizabeth Taylor has on my shirt on the floor with her face in my crotch. What? How am I ever going to tell the world this story and not be divorced? But anyway, we go racing through, and I finally lose them, and I get up to. She had two entrances to the house, the big entrance and the back entrance. So I pull up to the back entrance and come around and open the door. Now we'd had vodka in the car, I must tell you. So she, between stopping and starting, she was having a few vodkas with her. And so we get home, get to her house, and I jump out of the car and run around to open the door. And out of the corner of my eye, I see this little couple from Des Moines or somewhere walking up saying, yeah, that's right up there is where Richard and Elizabeth live. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could see her? With that, I open the door and she falls out. And I thought, oh, God, wouldn't that be wonderful if I could say, well, here she is, America. But anyway, so I get her up and hustle her and get her into the house. We have a lot of farewell champagne. We leave the next day. John goes back to Palm Beach. I go back to Dallas to reconcile with my wife and Mr. Stanley. And then we wait for John to get all the negatives done, which he gets that done. And then John and I meet out in California, because at this point Richard who was up for the Academy Awards for Anne of a Thousand Days, and Elizabeth were out at the Beverly Hills Hotel in one of the bungalows. So John and I go out with this, just multitudinous shots, and Elizabeth starts looking through them, and she starts discarding them, and then this one's good, and then everyone that she discarded, John said, well, I'll get rid of those. And she said, no, I'll do that. She takes these scissors and she starts cutting through all these shots that she didn't like. And so she approved them. And then I took the photographs and went to New York and met with Life magazine and Look magazine. And Look magazine promised us the cover. I think that may have been John's first national cover. I'm not sure, but it may have been. And the deal, they would do that if they could have an interview with Elizabeth and Richard. So I get on the phone to Elizabeth and Richard again, and I said, I'm back. Here we are. Yes, Look's going to do the cover, but they want to have an opportunity to visit with you too. And Elizabeth couldn't have been more charming, and said absolutely. And so they sent a writer out to Los Angeles. Oh, the stipulation was that I'd be sitting there with her, and I said, of course I would. So I sat there with Richard and Elizabeth during the whole interview process for the magazine, and it came out. It was one of their best sellers. It's a great shot. The pictures on the inside were wonderful, and I since I'm the last person alive that was in that shoot, I'd love to have an opportunity to see some of them put together in a display at an art gallery telling the story. I think it would be wonderful and be interesting, and it was an unusual and experience for me as a young man, and for John, who was even younger than I. And what went from there is John came to Dallas and opened a studio, and he moved his primary studio from Palm Beach to Dallas because he was so well received. He continued to go to East every year and photograph families at the Hamptons and other places up in Nantucket in that part of the world. But his primary studio from then on was in Dallas, Texas, till the day, unfortunately, that he died, and we miss him. John was the easiest person in the world to get to know. There was no guile to the man. He was a tremendous talent, incredible talent. And most people that talented are self-absorbed and not easy to be with, and have all kinds of hang-ups, and the litany list goes on forever for people that have that kind of talent. And but he wasn't that way. He was very much a man's man, and he was easy to talk to and easy to be with. And yet, when it would come time to photograph, it came time to photograph Elizabeth Taylor, he knew all the right things to say, and the right look and the right presentation. And when it came time to photographing an 18-month-old baby, he could do the same thing. And he could make a baby smile or an Elizabeth Taylor smile. And that took great talent. He was he was my friend from that day till the day he died, and not only my friend but a lot of people's friends. And he was a wonderful father to his kids, and he uh, had some incredible stories himself about some shoots crazy shoots that he went on, and I was thrilled and delighted to call him my friend, and that we maintained that friendship. And he was wonderful. All the photographs he took of my family, I mean, all my kids to this day love him. And he photographed all my daughter's weddings except the last one, and his son photographed that. Elizabeth Taylor knew exactly who she was and what her public expected. Um, for instance, she was going to be obviously dressed, one of the presenters at the Academy Award when Richard was up for one. And that's when, at the same time, Look was doing the stories when we were talking about all that. And being from Neiman Marcus, and I was trying to get her to take a look at some of the more famous fashion forward designers at the time, Jimmy Galanos, Valentino, uh, Jeffrey Bean, etc. And she said, no, I'm going to have it designed by one of the studios. And it was plunging, and it was everything. And then she added all that incredible jewelry that she had, which she kept, incidentally, in a drawer in the front room of the bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel. No guards. This was a long time ago. No security, nothing. Just in a drawer. And the night of the Academy Award, when at the party afterwards, I went over to, I was sitting at Liza Minnelli's table, and I went over to hers, which was next to us, and I knelt down and I said, Elizabeth, you know what your public expects. You're absolutely right on. You look exactly like you should be looking. Don't ever listen to anybody like me that tries to tell you to do something else. You be who you are. And she was. She had a wonderful sense of humor. She was very ribald, of course. She'd seen it all. She had been through all of it, and she survived it. Judy Garland didn't. So many of them that came along, those young people that started acting very early, blew out. She never did. She had her problems, but she could always steady up when she had to be in front of a camera. And she could lose that weight. She could do whatever she needed to do to please her public. And that's why she was such an icon. Richard um, had the most melodious voice I've ever heard coming out of a male. I mean, it was almost like the sirens beguiling you. I mean, it was velvet. It was so smooth. It just flowed, and I suspicion that's what got Elizabeth's attention when she first met him, because he acted entirely different than his voice would lead you to believe that he was going to act, and she liked that. She liked that mixture. They were a wonderful love hate pair, uh, and their time, I mean, there was no other couple that had the notoriety and the publicity and could command the audiences that Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton could command.